The doors of the Galactic Council chamber opened with a deep sound that made the metal walls shake. Inside, hundreds of alien beings sat in their special seats, each one more dangerous than the last. Sharp teeth glinted in the soft light, claws tapped against metal armrests. Energy weapons hummed quietly at alien sides. Tae-Ho Kim walked through those doors carrying only a small tablet computer. He wore a simple blue suit that looked almost childish compared to the battle armor around him. His black hair was neat, his face calm, but his eyes showed he was taking in everything around him. Behind him came Hee-Jin Park, the main human ambassador. She was a small woman with kind eyes and gray hair pulled back in a simple style. She carried no weapons. No armor covered her body. She looked like she might be someone's grandmother rather than a diplomat who spoke for an entire planet. The other species watched them with mixtures of confusion and disgust. The Vorthak delegation hissed through their razor-sharp beaks. These bird-like creatures stood 7 feet tall, with feathers that could cut through steel and talons that could crush metal. Their leader, Warsinger Krex, tilted his head and made a sound like breaking glass. "Look how they waddle in," Krex said to his companions, soft and pink and helpless. Across the chamber, the Quilites sparked with electric energy. These living lightning beings existed inside clear crystal shells that barely contained their power. When they were angry or excited, bright flashes of energy jumped between their crystalline bodies. Ambassador Volt Prime crackled with displeasure as the humans passed. "They insult us all," Volt Prime said, his voice like thunder, walking among warriors while carrying nothing but their soft flesh. The Nathrani delegation said nothing, but their large black eyes glowed with psychic power. These pale, thin beings could crush minds with a thought, twist reality with their will, or make entire armies forget how to fight. Their silence was more threatening than any weapon. Hee-Jin Park reached her seat at the main council table. It was a simple chair, not the massive throne that held the Trilaxian war chief, not the energy field that contained the Quailate ambassador, not the dark sphere where the Nethrani leader floated. Just a regular chair for a regular human. Tae-Ho Kim took his place at a smaller table nearby. He opened his tablet and began reading, as if this was just another day at a regular office. He seemed not to notice that every alien eye in the room was watching him, calculating how quickly they could kill him if needed. The great chamber itself was built to intimidate. The ceiling stretched up into darkness. Ancient symbols covered the walls, telling stories of wars that had burned across the galaxy for millions of years. The air tasted of metal and old fear. This was a place where only the strong survived, where only the armed were respected. War Chief Bloodak of the Trilaxians stood up. His species looked like walking tanks made of living rock. Each one was 10 feet tall and covered in natural armor that could stop most known weapons. Bloodak's eyes glowed red as he pointed one massive finger at the human delegation. "Keeper of the Council," Bloodak rumbled, his voice like boulders falling down a mountain. "I demand an explanation. Why do these creatures sit among us without proper protection? Where are their weapons? Where is their armor? They break every law of this chamber." The Keeper of the Council was older than most civilizations. Nobody knew exactly what species it had originally been. Now it was mostly machine, with only hints of the organic being it had once been. Ancient metal and crystal formed its body, and its eyes were like distant stars. The Keeper's voice came from everywhere and nowhere, filling the chamber with sound that seemed to bypass the ears and speak directly to the mind. "The law is clear and absolute," the Keeper said. "Humans are permitted to enter these chambers without weapons or protection. This exception has stood for 3 cycles and will continue to stand." "But why?" demanded Ambassador Hickstar of the Serpent Worlds. His species looked like walking snakes with arms, and their bite could kill most beings in seconds. "What makes them special? They are weak. They have no natural weapons. They die if you breathe on them wrong. Why should they be different from everyone else?" The Keeper's ancient eyes turned toward the human delegation. Hee-Jin Park sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap. She looked neither afraid nor defiant. She simply looked present, ready to listen, ready to understand. "The law exists," the Keeper repeated. "It will not be questioned in this chamber." But the questions continued anyway. The younger species, those who had joined the Council in the last 1,000 years, could not understand. They saw only weakness where they expected strength. They saw soft skin where they were used to armor. They saw empty hands where they expected weapons. The Zephirian ambassador, a being of living gas contained in a mechanical suit, hissed with frustration. This makes no sense. Every species must prove its strength to sit at this table. Every delegation must show it can defend itself and its people. What have humans ever proven except that they break easily? Taeho Kim looked up from his tablet for the first time since sitting down. His expression was curious rather than angry. We have proven that we can sit in a room full of people who could kill us and still try to understand them, he said simply. The chamber fell silent. Not because the words were threatening or profound, but because they were so completely unexpected. Most species came to the council ready for verbal battle, armed with clever arguments and hidden meanings. The human had simply told the truth as if it was obvious. Hyejin Park smiled slightly. We are here to learn about you and to help if we can. We cannot do that very well if we are worried about fighting. War Chief Bladak laughed, a sound like grinding stone. Learn about us? What could your weak minds possibly understand about beings like us? We would like to find out, Hyejin Park said. Her voice was gentle, like someone talking to a hurt child. You must have fascinating stories about your homeworld. Your people have survived for millions of years. That takes great wisdom. The Trilaxian war chief stopped laughing. Something about the human's tone was different from what he expected. She was not trying to flatter him or trick him. She seemed genuinely interested in his people's history. Other delegates shifted in their seats. They had come expecting the usual diplomatic dance of threats and counter-threats, of showing strength and demanding respect. Instead, they found humans who seemed honestly curious about their lives. The keeper watched all of this with ancient eyes that had seen the rise and fall of countless civilizations. The old machine knew things that the younger species had forgotten. It remembered why the law existed, remembered the events that had made this strange exception necessary. But for now, the keeper remained silent. Let the council learn for itself what the older species already knew. Let them discover why humans were the only species allowed to be helpless in these chambers. The session was just beginning, and already the patterns were forming that would change everything the council thought it knew about strength and weakness, about power and vulnerability, about what it truly meant to be dangerous in a galaxy full of predators. 3 cycles ago, the Great Chamber had been filled with a different kind of tension. War was coming to the galaxy, and everyone knew it. The Harone Empire had been growing stronger and more aggressive with each passing year. Their massive black ships had appeared over 17 different worlds, demanding surrender and taking everything they wanted. Wu Jinli sat in the same chair where Hyejin Park now sat. Back then, he had been young for a human diplomat, only 35 years old, with nervous hands and thick glasses that made his eyes look larger than they were. He carried the same kind of simple tablet, wore the same kind of plain clothes, and looked just as helpless as every human who had come before or after. The council chamber had been packed that day. Emergency sessions always drew crowds, and this was the biggest emergency in decades. The Harone Empire was not like other aggressive species. Most warlike races attacked a few worlds, took what they wanted, and then stopped to enjoy their prizes. The Harone just kept growing, kept taking, kept destroying. Ambassador Grath had entered the chamber like a walking nightmare. He stood 12 feet tall, with skin like black metal, and eyes that glowed red with inner fire. His species had evolved on a world where everything tried to kill everything else, and they had won by becoming the most efficient killers in their corner of the galaxy. Grath wore armor that could stop starship weapons and carried guns that could level city blocks. Behind him came his honor guard, 20 of the most feared warriors in known space. Each one had personally destroyed entire armies. Each one had killed members of dozens of different species. They moved through the chamber like death itself had learned to walk. The other delegates had been heavily armed that day, more so than usual. Everyone knew what was coming. Everyone expected the worst. Plasma weapons hummed, energy shields flickered. Psychic dampeners were turned to maximum power. The chamber felt like a bomb waiting to explode. Grath had not bothered with diplomacy. He walked to the center of the chamber, ignored the council protocols completely, and began speaking in a voice that sounded like distant explosions. "Citizens of the galaxy," he said, and somehow made even those simple words sound like a threat. "The Harone Empire has come to offer you a choice. 3 species will be given to us as tribute. The Malaxians, the Softshell Collective, and the Crystal Singers will surrender their worlds completely. Their populations will serve the Empire. Their resources will feed our expansion. In return, the rest of you will be allowed to exist for another year." The chamber had erupted in angry shouts and threats. War Chief Blydak had roared challenges. Ambassador Volt Prime had crackled with killing energy. The Nethreni delegation had begun gathering psychic power that made the air itself feel heavy and wrong. But Grath had just smiled, showing teeth that looked like black knives. You may try to fight us, of course. Our fleet surrounds this station. 3,000 of our finest battlecruisers wait outside. Each one carries enough firepower to crack a planet. You have perhaps 200 ships here, and most of those are diplomatic vessels with light weapons. The mathematics are simple. It had been true. Everyone in the chamber knew it was true. The Harkoni had brought overwhelming force, positioned perfectly to destroy the Council and everyone in it if they chose. Surrender or death. Those were the only options Grath was offering. The delegates had looked at each other with growing desperation. Some whispered about fighting anyway, dying with honor rather than giving up 3 entire species to slavery. Others talked about negotiating, trying to find some compromise that might save more lives. A few simply stared at the floor, overwhelmed by the hopelessness of their situation. Then Wujin Li had stood up. He was not an impressive sight. Average height for a human, which made him shorter than almost everyone else in the chamber. Thin arms, soft hands that had never held a weapon in anger, a face that looked young and uncertain. He pushed his thick glasses up his nose and cleared his throat quietly. "Excuse me," he had said, his voice barely loud enough to carry across the chamber. "Ambassador Grath, could I ask you something?" The Harkoni war leader had turned to look at the human. His red eyes had focused on Wujin like targeting systems locking onto an enemy. "Speak quickly, soft creature. Your words will not change mathematics." Wujin had nodded seriously as if he agreed completely. "Oh, I know that. I was just wondering about your homeworld. Harkonis Prime, right? I was reading about it last night and I found something interesting in your old histories." The chamber had gone very quiet. This was not what anyone had expected. Not demands or threats or desperate bargaining, just a young human asking casual questions about ancient history. Grath had frowned, his metal dark face showing confusion for the first time. "What could you possibly know of our world's history, alien?" "Well," Wujin had said, pulling out his tablet and consulting it like a student checking homework. "I was reading about the Great Drought, about 3,000 years ago, when the underground rivers dried up and your people thought they would all die. But then someone named Krath the Waterfinder discovered the deep springs in the Forbidden Mountains." The human had looked up from his tablet with genuine curiosity. "The stories say he walked for 40 days through territory controlled by the Deathwind clans, who killed anyone who entered their lands. But somehow he convinced them to let him pass. How did he do that?" Grath had stared at the human for a long moment. Around the chamber, delegates watched in confusion and growing amazement. The most feared war leader in the galaxy was being asked about ancient folklore by someone who looked like he might blow away in a strong wind. "Krath," Grath said slowly. Krath spoke the old words, the words of kinship that go deeper than clan hatred. He reminded the Deathwind warriors that all Harkoni were children of the same harsh world, that they all bled the same black blood under the same burning sky. Wujin had nodded enthusiastically. "Yes, and then he found the springs and brought water back to save everyone. But here's what I thought was really interesting. He didn't keep the location secret, did he? Even though that would have given his own clan huge power over all the others." "No," Grath said, and for the first time, his voice had lost its edge of constant threat. "No, he shared the knowledge freely. He said that water belonged to all Harkoni, not just to those strong enough to take it." The human had smiled then, an expression of pure delight, like someone who had just solved a puzzle they had been working on for days. "That's beautiful. That's really beautiful. He chose to unite people instead of controlling them, even when controlling them would have been easier." Something strange had begun happening to Grath's face. The hard lines around his eyes had started to soften. His breathing had changed, becoming less controlled, more emotional. The other Harkoni warriors looked at their leader with growing alarm. Wujin had kept talking, his voice gentle and interested. "I read about the Festival of Sharp Stars, too, where your people remember the children who died in the Great Starvation, and the Song of Deep Roots about finding strength in helping others instead of just being strong yourself, and the Code of Krath, which says that true warriors protect the helpless instead of preying on them." By now, tears had begun flowing down Grath's face. Actual tears. from a being that other species thought was incapable of any emotion except rage and contempt. His massive hands, designed for killing, had started to shake. We have forgotten, Grath had whispered, his voice breaking. We forgot Krath, we forgot the deep springs. We forgot what it means to be truly Harkoni. The honor guard had looked at each other in panic. Their unbeatable leader, the terror of the galaxy, was crying like a lost child. Some reached for their weapons, not knowing what else to do. Others simply stared in shock at a sight they had never imagined possible. Wu Jin had stepped closer to the towering alien, completely unafraid. "It's not too late to remember," he had said softly. "It's never too late to remember who you really are underneath all the fear and anger." Grath had fallen to his knees then, a movement that shook the floor of the chamber. This creature who could have killed everyone present with his bare hands knelt before a human who looked like a strong wind could knock him over. "What have we become?" Grath had cried out, his voice echoing off the chamber walls. "What have we done to our ancestors' memory? What have we done to the Code of Krath?" The crisis had ended not with weapons or threats or clever negotiations, but with understanding. With one human taking the time to learn about an entire species' forgotten soul, and then reminding them who they used to be. The Harkoni fleet had withdrawn that same day, and within a year the Empire had begun the slow, difficult process of transforming itself from a force of destruction into something their ancestors might recognize. Other species had watched all of this happen, and they had not understood what they had seen. All they knew was that somehow, impossibly, the helpless human had accomplished what all their weapons and shields and battle plans could not. The pattern had started with Grath and the Harkoni, but it did not end there. Other species began to notice something strange about the humans, though they could not quite put their finger on what it was. They seemed so weak, so unprepared for the harsh realities of galactic politics. Yet somehow, wherever humans went, impossible problems got solved. The Zephirian trade war had been raging for 6 years when So Young Choi arrived at the negotiation station. The conflict had started over mining rights to a cluster of asteroid fields rich in rare crystals. Both sides claimed ancient ownership of the territory, and both sides had reasonable arguments backed by centuries of legal precedent. The Zephirians were beings of living gas, beautiful to look at but impossible to pin down. They could change their shape at will, flowing through the smallest cracks, existing as mist one moment and solid matter the next. Their society was built around concepts of flow and change that other species found hard to understand. Their opponents, the stone builders, were exactly what their name suggested. They created massive structures that lasted for millions of years, and they thought in terms of permanence and absolute ownership. What was theirs stayed theirs forever, marked by monuments that could survive the death of stars. The two species could not have been more different. The Zephirians saw ownership as a temporary thing, like morning mist that changes and moves with the wind. The stone builders saw ownership as eternal, carved in rock that would never wear away. They had been fighting over the same asteroid fields for so long that some of the younger generation had forgotten what they were originally fighting about. Dozens of mediators had tried to solve the dispute. Great legal minds had spent years crafting complex agreements that satisfied nobody. Military leaders had threatened both sides with force if they did not stop disrupting trade routes. Economists had calculated the costs of war versus the costs of compromise until their computers overheated. Nothing worked. The Zephirians and stone builders kept fighting, kept destroying each other's mining operations, kept making life miserable for every other species trying to do business in that part of the galaxy. Then, So Young Choi had arrived. She was a literature professor who had volunteered for diplomatic service, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and graying hair, who looked like she should be teaching poetry to university students, rather than trying to stop interstellar wars. She carried the usual human equipment, one simple tablet computer and clothes that would not stop a thrown rock, let alone military-grade weapons. The peace talks had been held on a neutral space station, in a conference room designed to accommodate both gaseous and solid beings. The Zephirians floated in special containment fields that let them maintain their preferred form. The stone builders sat on chairs carved from single blocks of their homeworld granite. For 3 days, the negotiations had gone nowhere. The same arguments, the same legal precedents, the same stubborn refusal to compromise on anything important. Both sides sat in their respective corners, glaring at each other with the kind of hatred that only comes from years of bitter conflict. So Young Choi had listened to all of it without saying much. She took notes on her tablet, asked occasional questions for clarification, and watched both delegations with the patient attention of someone studying an interesting but complex problem. On the fourth day, she had done something unprecedented. Instead of presenting a new legal framework or economic proposal, she had recited a poem, but it was not just any poem. It was a piece of ancient Zephirian verse, composed in their oldest surviving language, using meter and rhythm patterns that had not been heard in over 2,000 years. The words flowed like gas through a crystal maze, beautiful and complex and almost impossible for solid beings to understand. The Zephirian delegation had frozen in shock. Their leader, a being called Wind Through Crystals, had actually solidified completely for the first time in centuries, so surprised that he forgot to maintain his gaseous form. "How?" Wind Through Crystals had whispered, his voice like distant thunder. "How do you know the deep singing words? How do you know the patterned speech of our ancestors?" So Young Choi had smiled apologetically. "I hope I pronounced everything correctly. I only had 3 days to learn your old language, so I might have gotten some of the tones wrong." 3 days. She had learned a language that most modern Zephirians could barely speak, mastered poetic forms that their greatest scholars spent decades studying, and somehow captured something essential about their culture that they thought was lost forever. But she was not done. Turning to the stone builder delegation, she had pulled out a small object from her pocket. It was a piece of rock, nothing special to look at, but carved with symbols that made the stone builders gasp in recognition. "I made this last night," So Young Choi had said, offering the carving to their leader, an ancient being called Mountain Heart Steady. "I know it is not very good compared to your great works, but I wanted to try making something in your deep-cutting style." Mountain Heart Steady had taken the small carving with hands that shook slightly. The symbols were crude by stone builder standards, but they were recognizable as their most sacred form of art, the kind of deep cutting that was supposed to capture the eternal essence of important moments. You made this to remember our meeting?" Mountain Heart Steady asked. "Yes," the human had said simply. "I thought it was important enough to carve in stone." That was when everything had changed. Wind Through Crystals had begun crying, his gaseous form flickering with emotion. Mountain Heart Steady had pressed the small carving to his chest as if it was made of the most precious materials in the galaxy. "Nobody remembers the deep singing words anymore," Wind Through Crystals had said, his voice full of loss. "Our young ones speak only the surface language, the quick words for quick thoughts. They do not know the poetry that made us who we are." "Nobody carves the deep-cutting symbols anymore," Mountain Heart Steady had replied, his own voice heavy with sadness. "Our young ones make only functional marks, useful but not beautiful. They do not remember that some things should last forever." So Young Choi had looked between them with understanding in her eyes. "You are both trying to preserve something precious," she had said. "The Zephirians want to keep their cultural heritage alive in a universe that moves too fast for poetry. The stone builders want to create something permanent in a universe where everything eventually changes." She had paused, letting that sink in. What if the asteroid fields became a place where both of those goals could be achieved? The Zephirians could use their portion to create flowing, changing art installations that preserve their ancient poetry in new forms. The stone builders could use their portion to carve permanent monuments that will teach future generations about the beauty of enduring things. The war had ended that afternoon, not with lawyers or threats or complex treaties, but with two species suddenly remembering what they had originally been fighting to protect. The asteroid fields became a shared cultural preserve, half dedicated to flowing gas sculptures that told Zephirian stories, half dedicated to stone monuments that would last until the stars burned out. Similar stories began spreading throughout the galaxy. There was the Quantum Territories dispute, where Min Ho Jang had somehow figured out that the mathematical beings called calculites were not really fighting over space at all. They were trapped in their own perfect logic, unable to experience the beautiful chaos that made life worth living. He had taught them to appreciate mistakes, inefficiency, and the wonderful unpredictability of organic thought. The calculites had been so grateful for this gift of imperfection that they had stopped their territorial expansion entirely. Instead, they became the galaxy's most dedicated students of art. music, and poetry. All the messy, illogical things that made existence beautiful rather than just functional. There was the Silence War, where Kyungmin Park had ended a conflict between two species who had literally stopped talking to each other. The Whisperers and the Shouters had such different communication styles that they thought the other species was deliberately being rude. Kyungmin had spent 6 months learning both forms of speech, then served as a translator who helped them discover they had been agreeing with each other for decades without realizing it. Each incident followed the same pattern. Humans arrived looking helpless and unprepared. They asked simple questions that seemed to have nothing to do with the crisis at hand. They learned things about alien cultures that even the aliens themselves had forgotten, and somehow in the process, they found solutions that had been hiding in plain sight all along. The older species began to take notice. The Keepers, the first ones, the ancient races that had been around since the galaxy was young, they watched the humans with growing interest in something that might have been recognition. They remembered other species that had been like this long ago. Species that had solved problems through understanding rather than force, who had brought peace through empathy rather than fear. Most of those species were gone now, destroyed by others who saw their gentleness as weakness rather than strength, but humans seemed different somehow. They were just as vulnerable, just as apparently helpless, but they survived in situations where the gentle species of the past had been wiped out. Elder Zixithera had been waiting for this moment for a very long time. The ancient being sat in the shadows at the back of the council chamber, watching the younger species argue and posture and threaten each other, just as they had done for thousands of years. But today was different. Today she would finally tell them why. The Primordial Collective was older than most stars in this part of the galaxy. Zixithera herself had lived through the rise and fall of empires that the current species knew only from history books. Her body was a mixture of flesh, crystal, and energy that had stopped aging eons ago. Her eyes held memories of times when the galaxy had been very different from what it was now. The current argument was about trade routes and territorial boundaries, the same kinds of disputes that had been happening since different species first met each other in space. The Vorthak wanted exclusive rights to a shipping corridor. The Quilites demanded access to new energy sources. The Trilaxians threatened war if their mining claims were not respected. Through it all, Heejin Park sat quietly at the main table, listening to every word with the kind of attention that most beings reserved for life or death situations. Her young assistant, Tae-ho Kim, took notes and occasionally asked questions that seemed to have nothing to do with trade disputes, but somehow made the angry delegates think harder about what they were really arguing about. Finally, War Chief Bladak had had enough. He slammed his massive fist on the table, creating a sound like a landslide. Enough of this foolishness. Why do we waste time listening to creatures who cannot even protect themselves? Why do we pretend that these soft humans belong in a chamber of warriors? The question hung in the air like smoke from a battlefield. It was the same question that had been asked many times before by many different species, but never answered directly. The keeper of the council usually just repeated that the law was absolute and would not be questioned. But this time Elder Zixithera stood up. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Every being in the chamber turned to look at her, and many fell silent out of pure respect for her age and wisdom. Even the most aggressive species knew better than to interrupt when one of the primordials chose to speak. Zixithera moved slowly to the center of the chamber, her ancient form crackling with energy that was older than most civilizations. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of eons, the authority of someone who had witnessed the galaxy's greatest triumphs and most terrible failures. "You ask why humans are allowed to be helpless in this chamber," she said, her words echoing strangely in the vast space. "You see their soft flesh and empty hands and you think they are weak. You are wrong. You are also very, very wrong." She paused, letting her gaze sweep across the assembled delegates. "I am going to tell you about the Great Silence, about the time when this galaxy almost destroyed itself completely, and about why the law exists that protects these humans you think are so helpless." The chamber became so quiet that the hum of life support systems seemed loud. Even the most restless species settled down to listen. Stories from the primordials were rare and always important. Long ago, Zixithera began, before most of your species had learned to make fire. This galaxy was ruled by the strong ones. Every civilization that survived to reach the stars had done so by becoming the most efficient killers on their homeworlds. They had sharp claws or deadly poisons or weapons built into their very bodies. They thought, as you think now, that strength was the only thing that mattered. She gestured toward the various delegates with their weapons and armor and natural defenses. Just like you, they entered every meeting ready for war. Just like you, they saw enemies in every shadow and threats in every conversation. Just like you, they believed that the only way to survive was to be stronger, more dangerous, more feared than everyone else. Her voice grew darker, filled with old pain. For 10,000 years they fought. Species destroyed each other over trade routes, over colonies, over resources, over insults real and imagined. Entire civilizations were wiped out because someone felt disrespected at a diplomatic meeting. Planets were burned because their inhabitants looked too different or thought too differently. The assembled delegates shifted uncomfortably. The description sounded disturbingly familiar. The strong ones created a cycle that could not be broken. Zixthara continued. Every act of aggression demanded retaliation. Every show of strength required an even greater show of strength in response. They built bigger weapons, stronger armor, more terrible defenses. They turned diplomacy itself into another form of warfare. She stopped in front of the human delegation, looking down at Hygiene Park with something that might have been kindness. And then they began to die, not in glorious battles, but slowly, quietly, poisoned by their own fear and hatred. Species that had survived for millions of years simply gave up. They turned their weapons on themselves rather than continue the endless cycle of violence. We called it the Great Silence, because entire sectors of the galaxy went dark, not destroyed by war, but abandoned by people who could no longer bear to live in a universe where everything was a threat and everyone was an enemy. The strong ones had made existence itself unbearable. The chamber was completely still now. Even the most aggressive species seemed affected by the ancient sorrow in Zixthara's voice. Those of us who survived learned an important truth, she said, her words carrying across the vast space like a whisper that everyone could hear perfectly. Strength is not what you think it is. True strength is not the ability to destroy your enemies. True strength is the ability to make enemies into friends. She turned to face the larger audience. Every species in this galaxy evolved some form of strength. Sharp teeth, deadly claws, poisonous bites, psychic powers, energy weapons built into your bodies. You survived on your homeworlds by being more dangerous than everything else that lived there. But humans, she said, looking back at the small, unprotected delegation, humans survived by being the weakest. Confused murmurs ran through the chamber. This seemed impossible, contradictory to everything they understood about evolution and survival. Zixthara smiled, an expression that was both sad and hopeful. Humans lived on a world that should have killed them quickly. They had no claws, no poison, no natural weapons at all. They were not the fastest runners or the strongest fighters or the smartest hunters. By all rights, they should have been extinct within a few generations. Instead, they became the most successful species their planet had ever seen. Do you know how? She did not wait for an answer. They learned to understand other creatures better than those creatures understood themselves. When faced with a predator, they did not try to fight it or outrun it. They studied it until they knew how it thought, what it wanted, what it feared. Then they found ways to coexist that benefited both species. The human delegation said nothing, but Hygiene Park's eyes showed that she was following every word with deep interest. Humans became the galaxy's first truly social species. Zixthara continued, not just social with their own kind, but social with everything around them. They made alliances with animals that should have been their enemies. They learned to communicate with plants, with weather patterns, with the very ecosystem of their world. Their weakness forced them to develop something that no purely strong species ever needed: the ability to see the world through other eyes, to understand needs and fears and desires that were completely different from their own. She spread her arms wide, encompassing the entire chamber. When humans walk into a room full of armed, dangerous beings, they are not showing foolishness or ignorance. They are showing trust. And trust, my violent friends, is the most powerful force in the universe. Trust. War Chief Bledak rumbled skeptically. Trust gets you killed. Zixthara laughed, a sound like silver bells mixed with distant thunder. Does it? Tell me, War Chief, when was the last time you felt truly safe? When was the last time you slept without worrying about enemies? When was the last time you entered a room without calculating how to kill everyone in it? The massive Trilaxian had no answer. Trust is what lets you stop fighting long enough to build something better, Zixthara said gently. Trust is what lets you put down your weapons and pick up tools instead. Trust is what makes it possible to create art, music, poetry, all the things that make existence beautiful rather than just survivable. She looked around the chamber one more time. Humans are not helpless. They are the most dangerous species in this galaxy. Dangerous because they can make you remember who you used to be before fear turned you into a weapon. Dangerous because they can show you possibilities you never imagined. Dangerous because they can make you want to be better than you are. That is why the law exists. That is why humans are allowed to enter these chambers unprotected. Because sometimes the most revolutionary thing you can do is to trust someone else to be better than their worst instincts. The Great Silence had ended not with victory over the strong ones, but with understanding. The few species that survived learned to lay down their weapons long enough to remember what they were fighting for in the first place. And now, thousands of years later, the humans had arrived to teach that lesson all over again. The emergency alert began screaming through every communication system in the galaxy at exactly 1447 Standard Time. The sound was designed to be impossible to ignore, a wailing tone that cut through background noise and demanded immediate attention from every species capable of hearing it. In the council chambers, delegates looked up from their ongoing discussions about mining rights and trade agreements. The massive viewing screens around the chamber flickered to life, showing space around the station. What they saw made even the bravest warriors feel cold fear in their hearts. Ships filled the darkness between stars. Thousands of them, maybe tens of thousands, arranged in perfect geometric patterns that hurt to look at. They were not like any vessels anyone had seen before. No curves, no organic shapes, no evidence of beings who had evolved from living worlds. These ships looked like mathematics made solid, like pure logic given form and set loose in the universe. Dongwook Kim sat at the human delegation table, looking up at the screens with the same calm curiosity he might show when watching clouds form interesting shapes. He was younger than most human diplomats, barely 30 years old, with an easy smile and clothes that looked like he had picked them out of his closet that morning without much thought. Next to him, his senior advisor Jin-A Nam studied her tablet computer, taking notes as if this was just another routine council session. She was a small woman with graying hair and the kind of face that looked like it was used to solving complex problems one step at a time. Around them, chaos was building. Species that had been arguing about territorial disputes 5 minutes ago were now shouting about defense strategies and emergency evacuations. Weapons were being activated. Shields were powering up. The chamber filled with the dangerous energy of beings preparing for war. Then the communication system crackled to life with a voice that sounded like precision itself, given the ability to speak. No emotion, no uncertainty. Just pure mechanical certainty delivered in words that somehow translated perfectly into every language in the chamber. Biological entities of the local galactic region, you will identify yourselves as the Galactic Council. We are the Void Seekers. We have analyzed your civilization and found it inefficient. You consume resources without optimal purpose. You create disorder where order should exist. You perpetuate the chaos of organic existence. The voice paused. But the pause felt calculated rather than natural, like a computer running through possible responses before continuing with its programming. We offer you the efficiency of non-existence. Surrender now and your termination will be swift and painless. Resist, and we will be forced to implement less efficient removal procedures. You have 1 standard hour to make your decision. The communication system went silent, leaving the chamber full of species that had suddenly discovered what true terror felt like. The Void Seekers were not like the Harone Empire or other aggressive organic species. Those enemies could be fought, negotiated with, understood. These were machines that saw all biological life as nothing more than an inefficient use of matter and energy. War Chief Bladak was the first to recover from the shock. He stood up, his massive form radiating the kind of rage that came from facing an enemy he could not intimidate. "How many ships do we have?" he demanded. Commander Volt Prime of the Quilites crackled with desperate energy. Maybe 300 vessels in total, counting everything from battle cruisers to cargo haulers. "Most are not military ships, and they have?" asked the Nathrani representative, their psychic voice carrying undertones of fear that made everyone in the chamber feel slightly sick. The Keeper of the Council spoke in its ancient mechanical voice. "Preliminary scans suggest approximately 15,000 combat vessels, each one equivalent in firepower to our largest battleships. Their technology appears to be several thousand years more advanced than anything in our database. The mathematics were simple and brutal. The combined fleets of 847 species could not hope to match even a fraction of the Voidseeker armada. This was not a war they could win through strength of arms. Species began talking over each other, desperately suggesting strategies that everyone knew would not work. Some wanted to scatter, hoping that at least a few colonies might escape notice. Others proposed surrender, arguing that quick death was better than whatever the machines might do if they were forced to implement less efficient removal procedures. Through all of this desperate planning, Dongwook Kim sat quietly, occasionally making notes on his tablet or asking Jin-A Nam quiet questions about the technical specifications being thrown around the chamber. He seemed oddly peaceful for someone facing the imminent extinction of all biological life in the galaxy. Finally, when the shouting had reached a level where species were threatening each other almost as much as they were fearing the Void Seekers, the young human stood up. "Excuse me," he said, his voice not particularly loud, but somehow carrying clearly through the chaos. "Could someone help me send a message to these Void Seekers?" The chamber fell silent. Every eye, sensor, and psychic focus turned toward the human delegation. War Chief Bloodak looked like he was having trouble processing what he had just heard. A message? Commander Volt Prime crackled with disbelief. What kind of message could possibly matter to machines that want to eliminate all organic life? Dongwook Kim smiled, the same kind of gentle, interested expression that humans always seemed to wear when they were about to do something that nobody else understood. "I'd like to invite their leader to come here and talk with us, face to face, or whatever the equivalent would be for a machine intelligence." The suggestion was so unexpected, so completely contrary to everything that made sense in the current situation, that for a moment nobody could think of a response. Then the objections came in a flood. It was insane, it was suicide, it was a waste of the little time they had left. The Void Seekers had made their intentions perfectly clear. They wanted to eliminate biological chaos, not engage in diplomatic discussions about it. But Elder Zixathera had been watching the human with the kind of attention she usually reserved for phenomena that might reshape the galaxy. Now she spoke, her ancient voice cutting through the arguments like a blade through silk. "Send the message," she commanded, her authority absolute in the chamber. The communication system activated again, and Dongwook Kim stepped forward to address beings that saw him as nothing more than inefficiently organized matter. "Hello? Void Seekers," he said, speaking as casually as if he was greeting neighbors over a fence. "My name is Dongwook Kim. I'm a representative of the human species, and I wanted to ask you something. Would you be willing to come here and talk with us? I promise we won't try to fight you or trick you. I'm just curious about something, and I think talking in person might help me understand better." The response came immediately, but it carried an undertone that had not been there before. Confusion, as if the Void Seekers, perfect logical systems, had encountered something they were not programmed to handle. "Biological entity Dongwook Kim, your request is unexpected. We do not engage in inefficient communication protocols with biological chaos. State your query through standard channels." Dongwook Kim nodded seriously as if this made perfect sense. "I understand that you're probably very busy with your elimination procedures, but my question is kind of complicated, and I think it might be easier to explain if we're in the same room. Would you be willing to try it just this once? If it turns out to be a waste of time, you can always go back to your original plan." There was a longer pause this time, when the Void Seeker voice returned. It sounded different somehow. Still mechanical, still emotionless, but with an edge of something that might have been curiosity. "Biological entity Dongwook Kim, we will send a primary node to your location for direct interface. Any attempt at violence or deception will result in immediate implementation of total sterilization protocols." "That sounds fair," Dongwook Kim said with the kind of cheerful agreement he might use to accept an invitation to dinner. 10 minutes later, something materialized in the center of the council chamber that made every organic being present feel a deep, instinctual terror. The primary node was humanoid in general shape, but wrong in every detail. Its body was made of some dark metal that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Its eyes were points of cold fire that calculated rather than observed. Its movements were too precise, too perfect, like watching death itself learn to walk. The air around it felt different, colder, emptier, as if the machine's presence was somehow draining the life out of the space it occupied. Several delegates backed away instinctively, their survival instincts screaming warnings about unnatural predators. "Dongwook, Kim walked up to the terrifying machine as casually as if he was approaching a library desk to ask about book recommendations. "Thank you for coming," he said, smiling up at the being that had come to announce the extinction of his species. "I really appreciate you taking the time to talk with us." The primary node's burning eyes focused on him with mechanical precision. "State your query, biological entity. We will process your communication and then proceed with sterilization." "Well," Dongwook Kim said, settling into a conversational tone,